So how did we go from prey animals to becoming the planet's most successful big cats? For that answer, we need to head back to the beginning, to when modern humans arrived in Morocco. See, if you want to hunt a big animal, you need a big brain to come up with a big plan. Humans took turns getting food, watching out for danger, and taking care of babies. The second reason is adaptability. The climate changed. Humans were able to adapt to warmer or colder temperatures by changing where they lived or what they ate. And that's why they were in Morocco, trying to steal water from the Neanderthals. Neanderthals preferred to hunt large animals like bison and wild cattle, but that required a lot of energy. Humans preferred to hunt smaller animals like deer and wild pigs, and that required less energy. I want to use my platform to give a voice to the voiceless, to breathe life into the dead. They've been an amazing collaborator and helped us make the sea show you love. But as always, it takes a village to make a sea show video. All the people you see here, and the ones you don't, they all had a hand in bringing this episode to your screen. So if you want to learn more about how ASCI show video is made, there's a link below. And if you want to support this channel and help us keep making more videos like this, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. So that's what we'll do next time. We'll use science to bring a member of a lost species back to life. And we'll ask them all the questions we have about their world. What did they sound like? What did they smell like? What did they taste like? And most importantly, what happened to them? Since there was a lot of prey, humans could set up traps, sneak up on their prey, or simply throw stones. For humans, hunting was a numbers game. If you missed one deer, you could easily find another one. But if you missed a bison, you might not find another one for days. In the end, humans won. The Neanderthals had no choice but to retreat or starve. But it wasn't easy. When the Neanderthals moved, they brought their culture with them, their language, their religion, even their lovers. Humans weren't interested in that stuff, and as time went on, they began to forget their history. The two groups probably didn't speak the same language. They probably had different customs and beliefs, and they definitely looked very different. It was simply too long ago. And the problem is that the older something gets, the more likely it is to be destroyed. Take this temple, for example. It's all that remains of a once great city, but no one knows where it is or what happened to its people. Or take this palace. It was once the center of a powerful empire, but today, it's nothing but a pile of rocks. And that's how most human history has been lost. Even though humans have existed for millions of years, we do not know much about them. Because most of their history was written on paper, and most paper breaks down after a few hundred years. What we do know comes from fossils, artifacts, and ancient DNA. But that only gives us glimpses of human history. We can learn about what they ate, where they lived, and even who they mated with. But we don't know what they sounded like, what they smelled like, or what they tasted like. Maybe they smelled like roses, or tasted like chicken. But unfortunately, there's no way to know. Neanderthals had shorter, stronger arms, longer bodies, and much larger brains. They also had bigger noses, bigger brows, and bigger everything. Basically, if you saw a Neanderthal walking down the street, you'd think, wow, that guy smells weird. But here's the thing. Neanderthals weren't some kind of monster. They weren't evil or bloodthirsty. They were just trying to survive the same way we are. They took care of their sick, buried their dead, and made art. In fact, they created cave paintings that show that they understood abstract concepts like perspective. In one painting, they even drew a horse with its tail and legs moving, suggesting that they understood the concept of motion. Of course, they also had to eat to survive, and that meant hunting. The third reason is our brain power. With a brain 3 times bigger than a chimpanzee's, humans could solve problems in ways no other animal could. And that meant better hunting strategies, new tools, and even social language. And the fourth reason is maybe the most important of all, death. As some humans died, others were freed from the responsibilities of taking care of them. They could focus on finding new food sources, creating new technologies, and exploring new lands. But it also meant bigger problems. The arrival of new predators forced our ancestors to work together in groups. Their descendants were spread across the globe and constantly evolving into new species. Neanderthals had evolved in Europe and Asia. Denisovans had evolved in Siberia and Oceania, and Homo sapiens had evolved in Africa. All told, there were 7 different types of humans living during this period. and they were all headed to the same watering hole. But this meant they had to compete with each other for food, mates, and land. And sometimes that competition got violent. In fact, recent evidence suggests that Neanderthals actually killed off the local human population in some regions before moving in themselves. But it wasn't just Neanderthals who were aggressive. The remains of another human species found in Siberia show that they had skull wounds from stone tools. They may have been killed by Denisovans, but humans weren't stupid either. Scientists recently discovered that the bones of one human species in South Africa show signs of healing, meaning they survived an attack and lived to tell the tale. And because they had to take care of more mouths to feed, they were forced to migrate. And as they migrated, they encountered more groups of humans who wanted the same thing: food, water, and land. Our ancestors didn't have guns or tanks, so they fought with what they had, their hands and their teeth. But fighting was risky. Most injuries were fatal, and when you died, you lost much more than a battle. You lost your life. Back then, humans looked very different than they do today, and I don't mean like with funny hats. Our brains were smaller, our bodies were hairier, and our jaws were full of large teeth, perfect for chewing meat and saying hello. They even walked upright like us, but also spent a lot of time in trees. And because their thumbs couldn't opposable, they used their feet instead. Kind of like me. But there was one thing that modern humans and early humans had in common: no pants. This wasn't the ideal situation. See, if you walk around without pants, your butt is going to get cold. And if your butt gets cold, your body will think you're dying. So to stay warm, humans would cuddle each other for warmth. But this didn't always work, because sometimes humans would get too excited while cuddling and boom, sex. And since women needed to get pregnant for our species to survive, sex was basically mandatory. But it came with a huge downside: babies. A lot of babies. Humans started having babies earlier and more often than any other animal. And that's why our ancestors had so many offspring. They simply lived shorter lives. But this meant that half of every generation died before reaching adulthood, which put a ton of pressure on the survivors. They now had to find food for themselves plus everyone else in their group. Our earliest relatives started out hunting small animals, but soon they had to start hunting larger prey. That meant bigger brains. But even with all these obstacles, humans survived. And scientists think there are 4 reasons why. The first is cooperation. And that brings us back to Morocco. 300,000 years ago, humans had been around for over 2 million years. Okay, so humans weren't always successful, but they were persistent. And it was in the hunt where the humans and the Neanderthals really clashed. In the middle of the Moroccan desert, about 62 miles from the nearest Starbucks, is a place called Taforalt. It's here where we find our story tonight, or rather, where we find its bones. 7 species of human fighting, mating, and living side by side. And it's hard to imagine because today, we're all pretty much alike, right? Wrong? 300,000 years ago, humans looked and lived very differently. In other words, this wasn't a horde of dumb brutes. These were strategic thinkers. They hunted giant mammals, bison, and wild cattle, which could be 10 feet tall at the shoulder. So needless to say, they were strong. And then they arrived. A completely new species, Homo sapiens, a thin, wiry people whose brains were getting bigger, but whose bodies were getting smaller. They could run fast, jump high, and breathe deeply. But they had one major downside. They weren't built for fighting. Well, as far as we can tell, it wasn't physical strength. That title goes to the Neanderthals, who were taller and bulkier than modern humans. In fact, the average Neanderthal man weighed about 200 pounds. Scientists believe that we benefited from the extinction of other human species. When a species disappears, its habitat doesn't become empty. It becomes available. Other species can move in and start building their own empires. In other words, competition sometimes helps us out. If you're lucky, maybe just a few minutes a day. But for our ancestors, it was a lifetime. Imagine spending your entire childhood learning how to fight, sneaking up on prey, avoiding predators, and this gave them a tremendous advantage, especially when it came to passing on knowledge. I mean, think about your own experiences, and that allows humans to grow exponentially. I mean, look around you. Everything you see, every tool, piece of clothing, bit of furniture, building, car, or smartphone, It's all the result of generations of humans learning from one another. This was a long, slow process that lasted hundreds of thousands of years. As long as we stick together, humans can conquer anything. Well, almost anything. Some humans thrived, and some struggled. Some groups advanced, and some fell behind. But in the end, there was only one clear winner. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it was our brain power, maybe our fighting style, maybe the way we passed on knowledge. But somehow we survived and we lived to tell the tale. How many times have you learned from your mistakes, or the mistakes of others? How many times have you read a book, watched a tutorial, or asked a friend for advice? Well, that's nothing new. Humans have been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. And they use a process called cumulative culture. That's the life of a human until 12,000 years ago, when they finally settled down and planted crops. Today, the average man weighs 200 pounds. It's not because he's fat. Their enemy was too. Homo sapiens had a massive advantage. They had something called symbolic thought. Essentially, this is the ability to think beyond the obvious, to come up with new ideas by combining existing ones. You know, like when you take a fish and a bird and you combine their characteristics and you get an airplane. It wasn't just a fight over water. It was a clash between 7 different ways of thinking. And in the end, it was the humans with symbolic thought who won. They were able to signal each other, think like a predator, and plan ambushes. That gave them the upper hand. It's because he's descended from the biggest species of human. Some were short and stocky, with wide noses and big jaws. Others were tall and lean with long legs and narrow hips. They never spread across the globe and conquered every continent. It takes intelligence, planning, technology, and social skills. And above all else, we learned how to work together. We developed complex languages and ideas and systems of belief, and that helped us survive. I mean, think of all the times when a friend or family member has helped you out, lending you money, giving you advice, or helping you study for a test. If life is a team sport, we win because we play better together. And that's where Homo sapiens really shined. You've just finished a hunt and brought back food for your family. You're tired, hungry, and ready to relax. And what do you see? A group of outsiders drinking from the stream, eating your food and sleeping in your territory. They fought for water, for food, for mates, for land. And that pushed all of them to the limit. It pushed them to adapt, to learn, and to grow. What would you do? Well, the Neanderthals did what any reasonable people would do. They fought. When faced with strong opposition, they grew taller and stronger. As a result, they became the most physically powerful human species that ever lived. But that didn't help them in the end. Living in a constant state of war doesn't pay off. In fact, it makes your life a lot more complicated. Some were barely 4 feet tall, while others towered over 6 feet 5. They didn't speak the same language. We now know there were at least 7 species of humans living 300,000 years ago. Maybe as many as 20. Now, most of them went extinct, but that's no surprise. Did they sacrifice animals? Each other? Was this a religion gone wrong? Did they fight a war they couldn't win? We don't know. But we do know that in the end, only one species remained. After all, there's only one of us left. But the details are really interesting because the truth is, we don't know exactly why they died out, share the same beliefs, or even have the same number of chromosomes. Like when 2 species mate, their genes combine, and eventually one group replaces the other. Other species may have died out because they couldn't keep up. Maybe they couldn't hunt quickly enough, couldn't outrun a predator, or couldn't survive without water. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Scattered among the animal bones, stone tools, and bits of old pottery, scientists found some very important things, a few scraps of DNA. Back in 2006, when these fragments were first discovered, it changed everything we thought about humanity. Turns out, 300,000 years ago, right here at this watering hole, 7 different kinds of humans gathered. You heard that right? Not 1, not 2, but 7 different kinds of humans all met up here under the glow of a full moon. We know a lot about them because at Taforalt, scientists found the best preserved ancient DNA ever. There was just one problem. All of this DNA belonged to humans from one branch of the family tree. The scraps couldn't tell us what other hominins were around, so scientists used the environment to fill in the gaps. They examined the animal bones, plant pollen, and signs of wear on the teeth of ancient tools. And what they found was shocking. Turns out, in terms of human evolution, this was a United Nations meeting of the highest order. There were at least 3 groups of humans who'd been migrating out of Africa. Maybe they were chasing bigger prey, or escaping from predators, or simply looking for new hunting grounds. Then there were the newcomers who'd evolved in Europe. These were the Neanderthals, tall, muscular, strong. They'd been living in the area for tens of thousands of years. In fact, they'd been here so long, they'd gotten comfortable. And this wasn't a band of nomads. These were territorial hunters. They defended their ground, and the Neanderthals weren't exactly friendly. The Neanderthals were smart, too. They made clothes out of animal skins, buried their dead, and took care of the sick and the elderly. So imagine you're a Neanderthal man. And that's when things got complicated. Because there were way more humans living in this world than just Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Some species of human may have simply disappeared because they were too genetically similar to another group. Like in Indonesia, scientists found evidence that some humans practiced ritualistic behavior. And that raises the question, what made us the last human standing? But size isn't everything. Even though Neanderthals were stronger than us, they never dominated the world. For example, we mastered the use of fire. We developed shelters and tools and weapons. Of course, we didn't win alone. That brings us back to the story at Taforalt. Here, 300,000 years ago, several species of humans fought for limited resources. Take the Neanderthals. Think about it. How much time do you spend worrying about your safety? How much time do you spend hiding or running or fighting? But that's still not the whole story, because it wasn't just the Neanderthals who were evolving. Thanks to symbolic thought, humans could plan ambushes, organize large groups of people, and memorize long sequences of numbers and letters. Basically, each generation builds on the experiences and inventions of those who came before. And that brings us back to that fateful night in Morocco. But this wasn't a war where one side was clearly winning. And maybe that's the real story here, the will to survive no matter the odds.